You look at the glittering facades of 1928 and see boundless prosperity. I see an empire of paper waiting for a spark. The entire financial edifice rests on a toxic, invisible foundation called margin debt. Buy today, pay with tomorrow's imaginary winnings. They believe they have finally conquered the business cycle, but they are merely feeding a sacrificial fire with cheap, unchecked credit. Wall Street mutates from a capital market into a high-stakes casino. The public is intoxicated by the endless rhythm of the ticker tape. The warnings are subtle, but they are there. Production slows. The massive industrial warehouses begin to quietly overflow with unsold goods. But the smart money ignores the physical reality of the factory floor. They are too busy engineering the final vertical ascent. September 1929. The summit is reached. The sophisticated players quietly begin to liquidate, leaving the public holding the bag at the precipice. October 24th. Black Thursday. A whisper of reality breaches the exchange floor. The machine hesitates, stutters, and then violently fractures. The shared illusion of value instantly dissolves. 16 million shares change hands in a blur of pure, unadulterated financial terror. A syndicate of powerful bankers steps in. They pool their capital, attempting a desperate, highly visible rescue to project artificial strength. It works for a day, but it is not a salvation. It is merely stage management before the final catastrophic collapse. The weekend offers no solace. By Monday, the contagion of fear mutates. On Black Tuesday, the floodgates of panic burst open completely. Fortunes that took a decade to painstakingly build vanish into the ether in a matter of hours. Value itself becomes a meaningless concept. Look into their eyes in the immediate aftermath. These are not statistics. These are men who were kings yesterday and paupers today. The initial shockwave violently hits the banks. These institutions, built on fractional reserves, are suddenly revealed to be hollow, empty shells. When the first bank permanently locks its doors, the panic becomes a physical force. It travels down the street faster than logic. Lines wrap around city blocks. People stand in the freezing rain, holding passbooks that represent their entire futures, waiting for nothing. They finally reach the teller window, yet only to be told the horrifying truth. Their money does not exist. It has simply evaporated. The government watches, paralyzed. They are trapped by an archaic, rigid belief in the self-correcting nature of the free market. The Federal Reserve, designed to provide liquidity, instead tightens the money supply. They apply a tourniquet directly to a suffocating patient. The real economy begins its agonizing contraction. The factories that hummed with endless production now sit entirely silent and cold. The workers are stripped of their livelihoods. They are cast out onto the streets, joining an ever-swelling, desperate army of the unemployed. The agricultural heartland is hit with a devastating double blow. Crop prices collapse entirely, leaving farmers drowning in inescapable debt. And then, the earth itself turns against them. Decades of arrogant overfarming meet a catastrophic drought, birthing the terror of the Dust Bowl. The soil turns to dry powder. The wind lifts it, creating suffocating storms that block out the sun and choke the livestock. The farmers are forced into a mass exodus. They pack their meager lives into jalopies and head west, chasing the illusion of California. The structural decay infects the cities. Shanty towns spring up in the dark, cold shadows of the monuments built by capitalism. They call them Hoovervilles. It is a bitter, mocking tribute to the president who promised them boundless prosperity and delivered absolute ruin. Hunger becomes a permanent, gnawing companion. Breadlines stretch for blocks, filled with men who once held respectable, secure jobs. The profound shame of standing in line for a bowl of watery soup eats away at the human soul faster than starvation. The social fabric begins to tear violently. Society is pushed to its absolute physical and psychological limits. Anger replaces despair. The veterans of the Great War march on Washington, demanding their promised bonuses. They are met not with gratitude, but with tear gas. The global order crumbles simultaneously. Nations retreat into panicked protectionism, erecting massive tariff walls that strangle international trade. The Smoot-Hawley Act turns a severe domestic crisis into a worldwide depression. It is a monument to sheer economic illiteracy. Deflation is the invisible killer. Every dollar buys more, but every debt becomes an infinitely heavier, crushing weight around the neck. The repo men arrive in the dead of night. They are the blunt instruments of the banks, reclaiming the vital tools of survival. Witness the horrific paradox. The government orders the slaughter of millions of pigs to artificially raise prices while citizens starve in the streets. They purposefully destroy abundance. Fields of cotton are plowed directly back into the earth. It is the absolute failure of free market distribution. In the vacuum of leadership, the demagogues rise. They use the radio to broadcast scapegoats to a desperate, starving populace. Extremism becomes irresistibly seductive. When the center cannot hold, the broken masses demand order and retribution at any cost. A new administration arrives in 1933, promising a New Deal. But before the oath is even sworn, the banking system completely seizes. The gears simply stop turning. The first major act of the new president is not a stimulus, but a total freeze. He declares a national bank holiday, locking every vault in America to stop the bleeding. The Emergency Banking Act is rammed through Congress in mere hours. It is an unprecedented, staggering expansion of federal power over private capital. The old rules are dead. Executive Order 6102 changes the very definition of money. Under the threat of federal prison, citizens are commanded to surrender their physical gold to the state. The ancient anchor of financial trust is criminalized. The dollar is intentionally unmoored from its physical restraint, allowing the government to inflate the currency at will. The state realizes that the banking system doesn't need actual capital to survive. It only needs the manufactured illusion of confidence. The fireside chats begin. The administration bypasses the press, broadcasting directly into millions of darkened living rooms. It is a masterclass in mass psychology and pacification. An alphabet soup of new agencies is born to patch the bleeding arteries of the economy. The government suddenly becomes the employer of absolute last resort. They build enormous public works, dams, bridges, and roads. It projects an image of recovery, but it is an artificial demand, built entirely on unprecedented deficit spending. They attempt to cage the Wall Street beast. Glass-Steagall physically separates the commercial banks from the investment casinos. The FDIC is created to ensure the illusion, but regulators are forever fighting the last war. The new firewalls only provide a dangerous psychological comfort, blinding the public to the new loopholes being engineered in the dark. On the factory floors, starvation mutates into open defiance. The sit-down strikes begin. Men halt the machinery of capital by simply occupying the space. It is a visceral, but dangerous standoff between broken labor and desperate ownership. The battle lines are drawn at the factory gates with pickaxe handles and tear gas. 1937 arrives. The planners, believing their own manipulated data, prematurely slash the stimulus. The economy instantly suffocates and collapses back into a severe recession. It is the terrifying, undeniable proof. The underlying disease was never cured. The market is entirely dependent on the artificial life-supporting drip of federal capital. Yet the state attempts to control the historical narrative of its own failure. They deploy an army of photographers to meticulously document the suffering they cannot cure. The poverty of the tenant farmer is captured on silver gelatin and distributed as a masterpiece of suffering to a paralyzed nation. Misery becomes a state-sponsored exhibition. Look closely at what the masses consume to survive the crushing reality. Hollywood manufactures a pristine, synchronized dreamscape of wealth and musical escapism. For a dime, the starving man can sit in the dark and watch millionaires drink champagne. Escapism becomes the most vital, untouchable industry of the decade. A vast, unmapped society emerges along the iron arteries of the nation. The hobo jungles. They live entirely outside the grid of failed capitalism. They share fires, scavenged food, and a profound, silent understanding of the system's absolute betrayal. They are the human debris of a leveraged society. Poverty undergoes a dark psychological normalization. It ceases to be an emergency and becomes a permanent, accepted geography of the American landscape. The elderly, stripped of their lifetime savings in the bank runs, face an unprecedented terror. Aging in the 1930s is not a natural decline. It is an economic death sentence. The state gambles on the Social Security Act. It is hailed as compassion, but mathematically, it is an intergenerational transfer of wealth designed to prevent a demographic revolt. The Dust Bowl migration permanently rewrites the map. Hundreds of thousands of desperate souls pour into California, only to find brutal exploitation and armed barricades. The independent family farm is systematically eradicated. The foreclosures destroy the lineage, and the land is absorbed by massive, faceless corporate agricultural conglomerates. While the middle class is annihilated, the true titans of capital quietly expand their empires. They use the crash to acquire hard assets for fractions of a cent. The intellectual foundation of the economy is violently overthrown. The classical belief in self-correcting free markets is buried, replaced by a permanent doctrine of state intervention. Look across the Atlantic. The contagion respects no borders. The Bank of England hemorrhages gold and abandons the gold standard, plunging international markets into an unmapped abyss. But in Central Europe, the Credit-Anstalt Bank collapses in Vienna. It triggers a sovereign debt crisis that tears through the fragile post-war European economy like a scythe. Economic despair breeds monstrous political expansion. When the middle class is annihilated, people do not demand liberty. They demand absolute order and vengeance. The United States attempts to hide behind the Neutrality Acts, building a desperate legislative fortress to keep the impending global slaughter at bay. But the architects of finance know the truth. The global depression is violently dismantling the peace. Desperate nations will soon conquer what they can no longer afford to buy. The pivot in Washington is sudden and absolute. The alphabet agencies are defunded. The political rhetoric shifts overnight from internal recovery to global existential threat. They realize the dark, ultimate cure for the depression. To save the American economy, they must become the undisputed, the highly profitable arsenal of a world on fire. The Lend-Lease Act is executed. America loans tanks and ammunition to desperate nations, knowing the debt will be repaid in permanent geopolitical subservience. The velocity of the new military-industrial complex is terrifying. When the survival of the state is threatened, the central bank suddenly discovers an infinite ledger. The unemployment crisis is not solved by economic innovation. It is solved by the draft board. The desperate men of the Depression are uniformed and handed a rifle. The excess labor of a broken nation is violently exported to the beaches of Normandy and the jungles of the Pacific. Prosperity returns. Dressed in olive drab, the factories are retrofitted overnight. Where civilian cars once stood collecting dust, heavy olive green tanks are now being aggressively, frantically assembled. The demographics of labor are violently and permanently rewritten. Women, previously confined to the domestic sphere, are thrust onto the heavy factory floors by the insatiable demands of the war machine. The commercial banking sector is entirely subsumed. They are no longer local institutions holding fragile farm mortgages. They become massive, centralized clearinghouses for federal war debt. War bonds are a masterstroke of mass psychology. They absorb excess wages to prevent domestic hyperinflation, binding the citizen's personal financial survival directly to the military state. The citizen trades the involuntary scarcity of the Depression for the state-mandated scarcity of the war effort. Ration books replace bank books in a rigidly controlled command economy. Before the smoke even clears from the global battlefields, the financial architects gather in the secluded woods of New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. They are building a new matrix. The British pound. The ancient sovereign of global trade is quietly dethroned in those conference rooms. The empire of the dollar is officially crowned. Every currency is pegged to the dollar, and the dollar is pegged to gold. The United States assumes the role of the undisputed global financial dictator. But the poison pill is already swallowed. To finance the war, the money supply was irreversibly expanded. The silent thief of inflation is permanently baked into the new system. Temporary emergency measures become the permanent scaffolding of the state. The income tax, once a temporary measure for the wealthy, is expanded to perpetually capture the wages of the working class. The corporations that survived the Great Cull emerge as indestructible titans. They use lucrative war contracts to obliterate competitors, creating an oligopoly utterly immune to normal economic cycles. Regulatory agencies like the SEC provide a dangerous psychological comfort. The public believes the casino is tamed, but the predators simply move into the complex, unlit shadows of the market. The Federal Reserve achieves its unspoken goal. It has fully conditioned the global economy to operate entirely on debt and fiat promises. The masters of the currency now possess absolute dominion. The survivors of the era die off, and the visceral, physical memory of systemic collapse fades. The new generation views the Great Depression as a quaint, unrepeatable historical accident. They embrace credit cards, massive mortgages, and margin accounts with the exact same intoxicating hubris that built the Roaring Twenties. The machine is fed the identical fuel. The architecture of the crisis remains entirely intact. Fractional reserve banking still creates currency out of thin air. The only difference is the terrifying scale of the numbers. Observe the modern central banks. When the cracks appear, they do not allow the deadwood to burn. They flood the system with synthetic liquidity, bailing out the very predators who engineered the risk. They are terrified of deflation, choosing instead to slowly execute the currency. The social safety nets constructed in the New Deal are revealed to be gigantic demographic Ponzi schemes. We look back at 1929 and see primitive gamblers. We look in the mirror and see sophisticated, data-driven investors. It is the exact same psychological blind spot. Leverage is leverage, regardless of whether it is recorded on a chalkboard or executed by high-frequency trading algorithms in a server farm. The math does not care about the medium. The true legacy of the Great Depression is the permanent, normalized intervention of the state in human survival. Free-market capitalism died in 1929. We trade within a centrally managed illusion. When the next systemic fracture arrives, it will not look like the 1930s. The banks will not lock their physical brass doors. They will simply be digitally frozen. The breadlines will not be on the cold, wet streets. They will be silent, catastrophic error codes on a digital welfare terminal. Poverty will become completely invisible. The state will not seize physical gold this time. They will seize the digital ledgers. Programmable currency will dictate every transaction, forcing negative interest rates upon a trapped, cashless populace. The ghost of Black Tuesday is not dead. It is waiting. It feeds on the trillions of unbacked fiat, the sovereign debt crises, and the derivatives markets that dwarf global GDP. The policymakers are completely out of ammunition. In the 30s, they could drop interest rates to zero. Today, they are already there. The inflation is structural and inescapable. When the contraction hits, the central banks will have no levers left. They will only have the printing press, running relentlessly until the currency shatters entirely. Capital is a force of nature. It cannot be permanently contained by legislation. If you build a massive dam of debt, the water will eventually, inevitably, rise over the concrete. The longer the natural, required correction is artificially delayed by the state, the more violent and absolute the final flood will be. History is not a series of dates. It is a permanent ledger of human psychology. The greed that caused the crash, as the panic that fueled the depression, these are unchangeable algorithms. The predators are already positioned. They do not fear the coming crash. They actively anticipate it. They hold hard assets waiting outside the fragile perimeter of the banking system. When the paper wealth of the middle class evaporates again, they will step in with flawless precision to acquire the physical world for fractions of a cent. The Great Depression was not an anomaly. It was a flawless, a terrifying demonstration of the inevitable end state of a leveraged fiat system. It is the exact mirror that the modern financial world desperately refuses to look into, terrified of the reflection staring back at them. The ledger is open. The margin is inevitably called. The illusion of eternal, debt-fueled prosperity is mathematically terminal. You can ignore the history. You can blindly trust the central planners. Or you can prepare for the inevitable, cyclical reckoning. And the choice is yours. But the math is absolute. They won't teach you this in school. They won't frame it this clearly on television. But history leaves fingerprints everywhere. If you're the kind of person who notices patterns, subscribe and tell me, have you started seeing them too? If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.